This is a mess. It ruins our standing on an international blowjob. It's more money being wasted. It's more time in this place being wasted when we could go after the traffickers, when we could go after the people exploiting vulnerable people fleeing persecution, when we could speak up for the very values that post-war we stood for in the world about supporting people who are at risk of prosecution. This legislation won't stop the boats, it won't stop the rot, and it won't stop the Tory party tearing itself apart. Britain deserves better, and with this side of the House, it'll get it.
This year is the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. What an irony and what a shameful indictment of ministers that our government is marking it by putting in front of Parliament a bill to wave aside our human rights obligations and the judgment of the highest domestic court in this land. This insulting and dangerous legislation attacks both human rights and our democratic structures. In doing so, it both demeans and disrespects the role the UK has played in helping to shape the international rules-based order, including its contribution to the drafting and early ratification of the European Convention on Human Rights in the aftermath of the horrors of World War II. On its very cover, this shameful bill has a statement that the government cannot say it complies with the UK's obligations under the ECHR, a terrible admission of this government's willingness to violate the principle that human rights are universal and belong to all of us by virtue of our humanity. It should not need saying that when you sign a treaty, you should stick to it. The UK government now has the embarrassment of being schooled by the Rwandan government, who, despite its own poor human rights record, is now sending out warning shots that even they will pull out of this shoddy deal if the UK government breaches international law to implement it. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I will be voting against this bill tonight because there's no tweak or amendment that can improve something that is rotten to its core. The bill before us today is a doomed and draconian attempt to reassert the Prime Minister's fragile claim to a non-existent authority, but it has serious consequences and sets an extremely dangerous precedent. These are deeply dangerous times in this country, and they are made more dangerous by this government. We've already seen the suppression of the rights to strike, the right to protest, and other democratic principles and standards being seriously eroded. Now we have this flagrant attack on human rights, on our courts, and on the separation of powers in this country. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I call upon this government to abandon its cruel, immoral, and unworkable Rwanda plan and to re-establish the UK's good standing as a member of the ECHR and international community.
Well said.
Simon Felt.
It is extraordinary that the government is presenting us with a piece of legislation that says on its first page it cannot confirm it is compliant with our convention obligations, with the rules of law that we all signed up to support. I think many members on the opposite side have been listening to Oscar Wilde when he said that the study of law was sublime, its practice vulgar. Legislation isn't vulgar, it's imperative to democracy. They should listen more to Winston Churchill, who said the idea of a Charter of Human Rights was for it to be guarded by freedom and sustained by law. But this legislation will not sustain those laws, it will diminish them. We should be proud we were the first nation to ratify the convention that set up the European Court of Human Rights, set up at a time when thousands of people were fleeing persecution, in recognition that the world didn't always get things right. Never remember the children on the Kinder transport who came to this country and their parents that we left behind. It is unimaginable in our own world to manage these issues on our own. That is exactly why we signed up to international treaties, to share the burden, to make a refugee system manageable, to deal with the fact that 60% of people on those boats are being granted asylum because they have a well-founded fear of persecution. And shipping a few of them off to Rwanda, just 5% of those, is at best an expensive distraction and at worst a deception at least. The only thing this piece of legislation will do is make a bad situation worse. Clause 5/3 provides the court cannot take an interim measure into account even if a minister has not blocked it. The bill also breaks our commitment to observe Rule 39 interim measures. In doing that, we breach our obligations under Article 13 of the ECHR, which require Member States to provide effective remedies for the infringement of rights in domestic law. In layman's terms, Parliament is being asked to commit the UK to a process breaching our obligations to protect people from torture. No other country has ever tried to challenge Rule 39 jurisdictions. They may not have complied, but this is a completely new departure for us to be leading. And the damage it will do to our status around the world is untold. It will also damage other treaties that we have signed up to. The Trade and Cooperation Agreement states explicitly if we end judicial cooperation, we undermine the agreement. The Good Friday Agreement states explicitly that denying access to domestic courts for individuals on the basis of the ECR contradicts its own commitments. And I'm sure our colleagues from Northern Ireland have recognised that we cannot override legislation in this way. And that means there will be countless legal challenges. We've already heard about the millions of pounds we've spent on a scheme where not a single refugee has been sent to Rwanda for processing. We've already spent £2 million on legal fees fighting this process. That's on top of the extra £150 million we've already pledged to spend on it. No wonder a ministerial direction has been required to uphold this policy. And Parliament can pass any law it likes stating things should happen. We can pass laws saying there shouldn't be smoking on the streets of Paris. It doesn't mean that it will happen. And that's the legal fallacy at the part of this, along with the Permanent Home Secretary saying there is no deterrent effect. I can keep saying I can sing. I could pass legislation to say I could sing. If you came to karaoke with me, you'd realise very quickly otherwise the truth. The cold, hard reality of the law is that this does not change the facts that the Supreme Court identified. And only the people who think it's a deterrent think they can somehow keep saying to the courts, no, Rwanda's safe, like some kind of Vicky Pollard approach to making legislation. It's time the British public woke up to what this government is doing. You cannot amend yourself out of this challenge without one side of Tweedledum and the other side of Tweedledee arguing anymore. This is a mess. It ruins our standing on an international blowjob. It's more money being wasted. It's more time in this place being wasted when we could go after the traffickers, when we could go after the people exploiting vulnerable people fleeing persecution, when we could speak up for the very values that post-war we stood for in the world about supporting people who are at risk of prosecution. This legislation won't stop the boats. It won't stop the rot, and it won't stop the Tory party tearing itself apart. Britain deserves better, and with this side of the House, it'll get it.
I have been in this House on many occasions now when we have discussed migration, and it saddens me that every time we do so, the narrative from this side of the House is invariably negative and pejorative. Immigration is always couched as a problem to be dealt with rather than an opportunity to be embraced. And I long for the day when we can have a positive discussion about the fact that almost everywhere in history where people have moved from one country to another, it has been to the benefit of the country to which they go. And we can also have a positive discussion about fulfilling our international and humanitarian obligations to people seeking sanctuary in this world, particularly since the 200 years of imperial history of this country was, and it gives us a very great responsibility to many of those problems.
Well said.
And it saddens me, some of the remarks, he's not in his place, but the member for New York, I think, will come to regret some of the things he said when he talks about immigration being this great scourge and tries to suggest that any alternative to what he is suggesting will result in a tenfold increase in boats coming across the Channel. This is an attempt to weaponise and politicise a very sensitive subject for political gain, and it is, I think, very distressing indeed. If there is a problem with migration policy in this country, then it is a problem that is made by this Conservative government. Let me give 3 examples. The first would be the backlog, which rose to a shocking level of almost 100,000 people waiting to have their applications determined. That was a simple management failure of not deploying enough resources to do the job that was in front of them. Incontrovertible, in my view, that statement, because the evidence is there that when they did employ more people and more caseworkers, the numbers turned and began to come down. And today they have 2,500 caseworkers working on these cases and processing these claims. The money that they have already spent in this expensive Rwanda gimmick would pay for 3 times that number of caseworkers. Imagine what could be done with that capacity in dealing with this problem. In the crossings over the Channel in recent years, 300 people have died in making that journey. Will someone please tell me, if people are prepared to make this very dangerous journey, in spite of the risk of death, why would they stop making it because of the much lesser risk of being deported to Rwanda? The truth is, these people have a right to come and apply to be here. They have a need to do it, and if we were humanitarian at all, we would respect that.
Those who think the bill should go further will get no help from this side of the House, in any of the parties on this side of the House, when it comes to committee and report stage. And as we've just heard, if the member for Stone's demands were to be met in amendments at committee and report stage, Rwanda would withdraw, and the member who's just spoken would withdraw his support for the bill. I don't know why anyone would vote for this bill, but voting for it, despite knowing that it's legally offensive or believing that it is fatally flawed, in the desperate hope that the government will help you amend it, is just delaying the inevitable. Because the most extraordinary irony of all is that the Prime Minister has had to rely on the Rwandan government to tell him and his MPs that Rwanda won't accept any law that breaches international law. Rwanda, which is theoretically, nominally democratic, but is in effect and in actuality an authoritarian one-party state, that's who's keeping us on the straight and narrow legally? Just think about that before you vote for this nonsense.
Yeah. The country deserves better, and as my right honourable friend from the Labour front bench set out in her excellent speech, time and again they're going for gimmicks and infighting over basic competence and good administration. It's 4 years since the Tories promised to end boat crossings in 6 months. Almost a year after the current PM promised again to stop the boats, 30,000 more people have arrived. Hotel use is going up, not down, as the Home Secretary claimed. It's at 56,000 at the moment, 10,000 more than when the Prime Minister promised to end hotel use. Criminal gangs are not being deterred. Convictions for people smugglers have dropped by 36% since 2010, and the criminal gangs are making far more money now than they ever were. The backlog of undetermined cases remains at 165,000, despite the PM's promise to abolish the backlog of initial asylum claims by the end of this year. It's folly to continue with this farcical failed joke of a policy when what's really needed is competent, good administration. Why not put the money being wasted on this policy into dealing with the actual problem? If the party opposite and the government were to actually try and do that rather more successfully than they've managed in the last 13 years, they might get some credit from this side of the House and from the nation. But there's precious little evidence that there's going to be any of that.